What happens when the most unpredictable force in American politics walks into the lion's den of late-night television, a domain built on mockery and controlled outrage? The answer detonated on a balmy Hollywood evening, in a studio where the air was usually filled with laughter, but tonight was thick with the static charge of impending chaos. This was not going to be another segment in the long-running political theater between left and right. This was a primal showdown, a collision of two entirely different realities, and it was broadcast live to a waiting, fractured nation. Jimmy Kimmel, the king of this carefully crafted court of comedy, was about to learn a devastating lesson: you can't use a quippy monologue to put out a 5-alarm fire. And the man lighting the match, Donald J. Trump, wasn't there to be a guest. He was there to become the host, the judge, and the executioner of the entire proceeding. By the time the last word was spoken, not by the seasoned talk show host, but by the former President of the United States, the very foundation of late-night television would be left in smoldering ruins. The atmosphere inside the ABC studio was less that of a taping and more of a political rally that had been crossed with a wake. The usual cheerful, pre-show buzz was replaced by a nervous, electric hum. The audience was a perfect microcosm of America itself, divided, anxious, and armed with cell phones like digital shields. On one side of the aisle, supporters wore red hats and T-shirts emblazoned with Trump 2024, their faces set in expressions of defiant glee. They were the invaders ready to see their champion storm the gates of the coastal elite. On the other side, the show's regular viewers sat with arms crossed, their faces pinched with a mixture of disdain and morbid curiosity. They were the defenders of the castle, waiting for their witty captain to slay the dragon with a perfectly timed joke. And in the middle, the undecided and the spectacle seekers leaned forward in their seats, sensing they were about to witness something that transcended politics, something raw, real, and utterly unscripted. Backstage, the energy was no less tense. Jimmy Kimmel paced in his green room, running over his notes. His writers had prepared a mountain of material: jokes about the indictments, gags about Truth Social, witty asides about Mar-a-Lago. The plan was classic Kimmel: use humor as a scalpel. To dissect and disarm, he would be the reasonable, everyman voice, using laughter to expose the absurdity he believed Trump represented. He saw himself as a modern-day court jester, the one person who could tell the king the truth through the veil of a punchline. He had done it for years, he was confident. A few rooms down, Donald Trump held court with his small entourage. There were no notecards, no rehearsed lines. His preparation was a lifetime of combat in the media, in business, and in the highest office in the land. He understood the optics better than any producer. He was walking onto enemy territory. For him, that wasn't a disadvantage, it was the entire point. This wasn't an interview, it was an incursion. He wasn't there to promote a policy or a book. He was there to put on a performance of strength, to demonstrate to his base that he feared no forum, and to look his detractors in the eye and show them he was unbowed, unapologetic, and stronger than ever. The moment arrived. The band struck up its familiar, brassy theme music, but the audience's applause was fractured, a messy cacophony of cheers and loud intentional boos. Kimmel walked out, his smile wide but tight, a man trying to project calm while standing on a fault line. He did his monologue, but the jokes about current events landed with a thud. The audience was too anxious, too polarized. They weren't here for the monologue. They were here for the main event. Then, the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, Kimmel said, the name feeling heavy on his tongue, the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump. He emerged from the wings not with a politician's wave but with a sovereign's nod. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, his red tie a slash of defiance against the studio's bright, cheerful set. He moved with that familiar, rolling gait, a swagger that communicated absolute assurance. He acknowledged the crowd with a slight lift of his chin, soaking in the roaring approval of his supporters and seeming to feed off the energy of the booth. He settled into the guest chair, his posture ramrod straight, his hands resting on his knees. The contrast was immediate and stark. Kimmel was all fluid motion and practiced charm. Trump was a monolith of imposing stillness. The first few minutes were a delicate, high-wire act. Kimmel, the seasoned ringmaster, began with what he thought was safe ground. So, Mr. President, Kimmel started, leaning back with feigned casualness. You've been busy. How is life after the White House? What's a typical day for Donald Trump? It was an open door, and Trump walked right through it. It's great, Jimmy. It's great. We have a great company, a great business. We're leading in every poll by a lot. A lot. They're all saying it's the biggest lead in the history of politics. The stream of consciousness began. Boasts about his properties, his social media platforms, user numbers, the size of his rallies. It was a well-rehearsed litany of success delivered directly to the camera, as if Kimmel were merely a conduit to the people at home. Kimmel interjected with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I've seen those polls. I've also seen some that show you in a very tight race. In fact, one just yesterday had you down by 2 points in a key state. Trump's affable expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Fake polls, Jimmy. All fake. They're the same people who had me losing in 2016. You remember. The same people. We see how that turned out. The retort was smooth, but the temperature in the room dropped a degree. The first parry had been made. Kimmel tried to keep it light. Well, they can't all be fake, can they? They are. They're suppression polls. Trump stated as if explaining a simple fact to a child. They're meant to discourage our voters, but it's not working. Our people are smarter than that. The audience rumbled, a mix of agreement and dissent. The wire was getting thinner. Kimmel, sensing the interview slipping into a Trumpian infomercial, decided it was time to wield his weapon. The grin became sharper, more deliberate. So let's talk about the other thing keeping you busy, Kimmel said, his tone shifting from conversational to prosecutorial. The, numerous legal challenges. Your supporters call it a witch hunt, a political persecution. But your critics point to the indictments, the evidence presented to grand juries. They say the justice system is just working as it should. How do you reconcile that view, that you're being targeted, with the sheer volume of legal challenges coming your way? The question landed in the studio like a lead balloon. The nervous chatter ceased entirely. Every phone was raised, every breath held. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Trump didn't flinch. He let the silence hang in the air for a beat too long, a power play he had mastered. He leaned forward, his hands forming a steeple, his eyes locking onto Kimmel's. The justice system. He repeated, his voice laced with scorn. It's not a justice system, Jimmy, it's a tool. It's being weaponized by a corrupt Department of Justice, by a weak administration that can't beat me at the ballot box, so they try to throw me in a courtroom. It's election interference. Plain and simple. Kimmel's smile was a thin, tight line. But with all due respect, sir, these are state cases too. In New York and Georgia are all of them weaponized. The DA in Fulton County. The Attorney General in New York. Are they all part of this same conspiracy? Isn't it possible that some of these actions, the business practices, the alleged attempts to overturn an election, aren't they just crimes? The word crimes echoed in the silent studio, a verbal grenade. Trump's composure cracked, his voice rose, losing its previous almost bored cadence. They're not crimes, they're a political hit job! A perfect phone call. They go after me for a non-disclosure agreement, a perfect phone call, while they let real criminals, and we have plenty of them. Our cities are burning, run wild. It's a disgrace! The whole world is laughing at us. Kimmel saw an opening and leaned into it, his comedic persona fully shed, replaced by the prosecutor he'd always wanted to be. And what about January 6th? The question was a dagger. You've called it a protest, but we all saw the videos. The violence, the breach of the Capitol, the gallows erected outside. Do you bear any responsibility for that day? Any at all? The air grew cold. This was the third rail, and Kimmel had not just touched it, he was gripping it with both hands. Trump's face flushed a blotchy red. It was a protest, he insisted, his voice booming, his finger jabbing the air between them. A protest against a rigged and stolen election, and I told them to go peacefully. I said, go peacefully and patriotically. You never play that part. The fake news never plays that part. You're dishonest. But you also told them to fight like hell. Kimmel shot back, his own voice rising to meet Trump's, his patience evaporating. For hours, you watched it on TV while they chanted "Hang Mike Pence." Did you ever think to call it off? To call in the National Guard? To get on television and tell them to stop? The mention of his former vice president seemed to ignite something volatile in Trump. Mike Pence. He retorted, his voice dripping with contempt. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to what should have been done. He could have sent the votes back to the states. We could have had a fair election. He failed the American people. Kimmel stared, his face a mask of genuine, unfeigned disbelief. The carefully constructed interview was now a smoking ruin. So you're saying he deserved it? The chance to hang him? I'm saying he failed the American people? Trump boomed, his voice echoing off the studio walls. And you, Jimmy, you sit here in your studio in Hollywood with your little jokes, and you have no idea what's happening in this country. No idea. Your dam was gone. The river of grievance was now a flood, and it was washing away the last vestiges of television decorum. The fire that had been smoldering was now a raging inferno, consuming the set, the audience, and the host himself. The studio felt like it was vibrating with the sheer force of the confrontation. The audience was no longer a collection of individuals but a single, stunned organism. The fire was now an uncontrollable blaze, and Jimmy Kimmel was being burned by the heat of his own making. Kimmel, his face flushed with anger and humiliation, tried to reclaim a shred of moral authority. With all due respect, Mr. President, that's not an answer. People died that day. Police officers were beaten. The peaceful transfer of power was disrupted. To dismiss it as a protest it's a rewriting of history that a lot of Americans, myself included, find deeply offensive. Trump scoffed aloud. Derisive sound that cut through the tension. Offensive. You want to talk about offensive? He was in his element now, the aggrieved party, the truth teller surrounded by liars. What's offensive is a border that's open to terrorists and criminals. What's offensive is the weaponization of our justice system. What's offensive is you, a talk show host, pretending to be a journalist. The personal attack was a direct hit. Kimmel physically recoiled, his professional mask shattering. I'm not pretending to be a journalist. I'm a citizen asking questions that you don't seem to want to answer. Because they're stupid questions! Gotcha questions! Trump roared, his face contorted. You're reading from a script your writers gave you. You don't care about the answers. You just want to make your little audience clap. He waved a dismissive hand at the crowd, a gesture of utter contempt for the entire apparatus of late-night television. Kimmel's hands clenched into white, knuckled fists on his desk. I care about the truth. I care about accountability. Trump laughed, a harsh, mocking bark that had no humor in it. You wouldn't know accountability if it hit you in your face. You have the most corrupt president in history sitting in the White House right now, and you do nothing. Your show does nothing. Because you're a puppet, they pull the strings and you talk. The accusation, puppet, hung in the air, ugly and direct. The line between interviewer and subject had been not just crossed but napalmed. You can't just insult your way out of every difficult conversation, Kimmel said, his voice tight and thin, the words sounding feeble even to himself. It's not an insult if it's true. Trump fired back. Leaning so far over the desk he seemed to invade Kimmel's personal space, a colossus of grievance. Look at you. You're shaking. You're nervous because you're not used to someone fighting back. You're used to guests who sit here and take it, who are afraid of you. Well, I'm not afraid of you, Jimmy. I'm not afraid of ABC. I'm not afraid of any of them. The audience was mesmerized. The partisan cheers and boos had ceased. They were witnessing something far more compelling than politics, a raw psychological dismantling. Kimmel, desperate to land a single solid blow, reached for the weapon he thought would be his ultimate triumph: mockery. It was the foundation of his show, his identity. You talk about fighting, but you didn't even serve Mr. President. You got bone spurs. You talk about strength, but when it was time to serve your country. He never finished the sentence. Trump cut him off, his voice dropping to a deadly, venomous whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shouting. The room strained to hear him. Don't you dare. He paused, letting the warning sink in. Don't you dare talk about service. What have you ever sacrificed? What have you ever built? He leaned in closer, his eyes blazing. I built an empire. I became president of the United States. You tell jokes for a living, you tell jokes. Don't you ever lecture me about service. The words were delivered with such pure, unadulterated contempt that they seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Kimmel physically flinched as if struck. His face went ashen. All the retorts, the witty comebacks, the prepared lines, they evaporated from his mind, leaving behind a vast, empty panic. For the first time in his 2-decade career, the quick-witted host was utterly, completely disarmed. The man across from him wasn't playing the game of television. He was playing a different game entirely, one where the only rule was total domination, and he was winning. The heat in the studio was no longer just rising, it was incinerating every pretense, every script, and every ounce of Kimmel's confidence. The air was so thick with tension it felt solid. The audience had become a gallery of statues, every eye wide, every muscle frozen. The duel had reached its brutal, inevitable climax. Jimmy Kimmel, stripped of his comedic armor and reeling from the personal, surgical strikes, was a cornered animal with no escape route. Donald Trump, sensing total victory, was a predator moving in for the final, definitive strike. Then Trump stood up. It wasn't a hurried movement. It was a slow, deliberate uncoiling, a powerful motion that instantly commanded the entire space. He loomed over the set, his shadow falling across Kimmel's desk like an eclipse. The iconic posture, the set jaw, the flinty eyes, it was the image from 1,000 rallies, but now magnified and broadcast into the intimate, hostile confines of his opponent's home turf. Kimmel, driven by a final, desperate instinct to not be dominated on his own stage, stood as well. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated. He was a boy trying to stand up to a giant. You can't just walk away from the questions. Donald, he said, his voice cracking, using the first name as a feeble, last-ditch attempt to establish familiarity to regain any shred of control. Trump didn't even look at him. He turned his body and faced the main camera, the one beaming his image live to the nation. He pointed a finger directly into the lens, his voice dropping into a low, resonant register that was both calm and filled with apocalyptic fury. I'm not walking away from questions, he said, his words measured, clear, and devastating. I'm walking away from this corrupt and dishonest show. This whole network, the fake news. The silence in the studio was so absolute you could hear the faint buzz of a stage light, the rustle of a producer's headset in the distant control room. The world had shrunk to this single, shocking moment. You sit here, Trump continued, now turning his gaze slowly, deliberately, to sweep across the stunned audience, and you laugh. You clap. You think this is entertainment. He turned his fiery gaze back to Kimmel, who stood paralyzed. He makes you feel smart for agreeing with him. He makes you feel good for hating the people he tells you to hate. But he doesn't care about you. He cares about his ratings. He's a puppet for the globalists and the Marxists who want to destroy this country. Kimmel stood frozen, his mouth agape. That's insane, he managed to whisper, but the microphone didn't pick it up. He was a ghost on his own stage, a spectator to his own professional execution. Trump took a step closer to the audience, his voice rising again, transforming into a sermon. A rallying cry delivered from the heart of Babylon. They think you're stupid. They think they can sit in their fancy studios in New York and Hollywood and tell you what to think. They mock your values. They mock your faith. They want to take your country away from you. He turned one last time to Kimmel, who was visibly shaking, his face a pale mask of utter humiliation and impotent rage. You want to know about accountability, Jimmy? Trump said, his voice dripping with final, searing contempt. I'm held accountable every day. By the fake news. By the deep state, by people like you. But you know what? The people, The real people, the hard-working Americans you never meet, they know the truth, and they are my accountability. Not never you. With that, he smoothed his tie, a gesture of utter finality. He gave one last sweeping, defiant look at the camera. This is why I had to run. This is the corruption I'm fighting. Good night, everybody. He didn't rush. He didn't look back. He strode off the stage with the same unshakable swagger with which he had entered, leaving behind a vacuum of sound, a studio in ruins, and a host who had been utterly, publicly, and historically dismantled. Jimmy Kimmel stood alone behind his desk, a statue of defeat. For a long suspended moment the audience remained in stunned silence, then they erupted into a chaotic cacophony, a wave of triumphant cheers from his supporters crashing against shouts of fury from his detractors. It was less an applause break and more the sound of a nation tearing at the seams, broadcast live from a Hollywood soundstage. Kimmel opened his mouth to say something, a joke, an apology, an explanation, but no words came out. His eyes were glazed, his confidence vaporized. He simply sank, slowly, back into his chair, the image of his defeat seared into the minds of millions as the producers, in a panic, finally cut to a brightly colored, absurdly cheerful commercial for a brand of soap. The aftermath was instant and seismic. Backstage, chaos erupted. Producers and assistants scrambled, shouting into headsets. The control room was a scene of panic. They had just lost control of their own show on a fundamental level, but it was too late. The internet had already been set ablaze. Within minutes, the entire segment was clipped, edited, mimed, and sent spinning into the digital stratosphere. Faye Trump walks out, Faith Kimmel destroyed, and Fate Late Night Meltdown began trending globally, not just in the political corners, but across the entire platform. Supporters hailed it as the moment their champion took the fight to the heart of the enemy and emerged victorious. Detractors called it the dangerous tantrum of a demagogue. But nobody, on any side, could deny the sheer, breathtaking power of what they had witnessed. The fallout was severe and lasting. For Jimmy Kimmel, it was a professional humiliation from which his show and his persona would never fully recover. His ratings, which had already been softening in a fractured media landscape, went into a tailspin. The carefully cultivated image of the witty, relatable everyman was shattered, replaced by the endless loop of him standing speechless, pale and defeated. Advertisers grew nervous. The cultural currency of his show was devalued overnight. In the days that followed, his monologues were subdued, defensive, and lacked their former punch. The confidence was gone. He had become a symbol of a media elite that had lost touch with and could no longer control the national conversation. For Donald Trump, the confrontation was nothing short of rocket fuel. His campaign donations surged to record levels within 24 hours. The clip became a staple at his rallies, played on a loop to roaring crowds who saw it as a modern-day version of David felling Goliath. He had done what no other politician had dared. He had walked into the lion's den of his opposition's most prominent cultural platform and not just survived, but laid waste to it. He was no longer just a political candidate, he was a folk hero to his base. The man who told the smug kings of Hollywood to their faces that their crown was fake and their throne was worthless. The incident became a permanent fixture in the political and media landscape, a case study in the shifting dynamics of power in the 21st century. Pundits debated it for weeks. Had Kimmel been unfair? Had Trump been unhinged? The debate was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the outcome. On the night he walked onto Jimmy Kimmel Live, Donald Trump wasn't just a guest. He was a force of nature, and he proved in devastating high definition that sometimes, the most powerful punchline isn't a joke at all. It's the truth as you see it, delivered without apology, and the stunned silence that follows. They had tuned in for a political circus. Instead, they witnessed a king toppling an emperor, leaving behind only the echo of a shattered set and the undeniable, terrifying power of a man who refused to play by any rules but his own.